I remember the smell of burning data crystal saw, sharp, metallic, like lightning trapped in glass, and underneath it all, the faint sweetness of melting polymers, a scent that shouldn't have existed in a place built to preserve forever. That was the day I understood that neutrality was just another word for cowardice, and that some truths die not because they're forgotten, but because someone chooses to look away while they burn. My name doesn't matter anymore. I was an archivist in the Grand Archive of Luminara Station, keeper of records that spanned 3,000 years of galactic civilization, guardian of treaties and testaments, and the quiet mathematical proof that empires always collapse in the same predictable patterns if you know how to read the data. We thought ourselves beyond the reach of politics, beyond the petty struggles of warlords and republics, and the shifting borders that lesser people drew in the void between stars. We were scholars. We were neutral. We kept the truth, safe in crystalline memory banks, buried 3 kilometers beneath the station's surface, in chambers where the temperature never varied by more than 1/10 of a degree, where humidity was controlled to the molecular level, where nothing could decay or corrupt or fade. We were fools. The hum of the environmental processors was the heartbeat of the archive, a deep subsonic pulse that you felt more than heard, vibrating up through the floors and into your bones until you forgot it was there at all. I had worked in the archive for 16 years when the war began, though we didn't call it a war at first, not officially, just a regional stabilization action initiated by the hegemonic council to address separatist elements in the outer systems. The language was always careful, always measured, designed to sound temporary and surgical and necessary. I filed the reports as they came in, cross-referenced them with historical precedents, noted the patterns that began to emerge: increased military production, suspension of judicial oversight in designated conflict zones, the gradual expansion of emergency powers that never quite expired when the emergency supposedly ended. I noted all of this in the metadata fields and thought I was doing my duty. The archive was built into the heart of an asteroid, one of the larger fragments in the Luminara belt, chosen specifically for its stability and its distance from major shipping lanes and military installations. We orbited nothing, drifted in the quiet spaces between systems, accessible only by scheduled transport or private courier with the proper credentials. The interior was a labyrinth of corridors carved from living rock, walls polished smooth and lined with climate-controlled vaults that stretched in every direction, each one containing millions of records stored on crystalline matrices that could theoretically preserve information for millennia without degradation. The main reading chambers were spherical, gravity-adjusted so that the floor curved gently beneath your feet, and the ceiling seemed impossibly distant above, lined with floating display terminals that responded to gesture and thought interface, glowing softly in the perpetual twilight we maintained to preserve the older physical documents. There were 247 archivists when I arrived, and that number rarely changed. We recruited only when someone retired or died, and the selection process took years, involved examinations in a dozen disciplines, required recommendations from 3 senior scholars, and a psychological profile that demonstrated the kind of patient, meticulous obsession necessary to spend your entire life collaging information you might never fulfill. I was 26 when I took my oaths, standing in the central vault before the chief archivist and the assembled staff, promising to preserve without prejudice, to maintain without bias, to keep the record complete and accurate regardless of my personal beliefs or the political pressures of any government or faction. I meant every word. My specialty was military history, specifically the documentation of armed conflicts and their resolutions, which meant I spent most of my time in Sublevel 7, where we kept the war records, the treaties, the casualty reports from 100 different civilizations that had risen and fallen in cycles so predictable you could set your calendar by them. I knew the signs. I knew what it looked like when a society began the slide toward total war, could identify the rhetorical shifts and the legal frameworks and the economic indicators that preceded atrocity with mathematical precision. I had studied the collapse of the First Concordiate, the purging of the inner worlds, the century of embers when 3 entire star systems burned themselves to ash over a trade dispute that spiraled into mutual genocide. I knew all of this, and I filed the reports about the regional stabilization action with careful notation and thought I was somehow separate from the pattern, somehow exempt because I was a scholar and not a soldier. The first clone soldiers arrived at the archive on a routine supply transport, 6 months after the war began. Nobody called them clones officially. The term was rapid cycle conscripts, men and women grown in accelerated gestation tanks and educated through neural imprinting, capable of reaching combat readiness in 18 months, instead of 18 years. They were polite, efficient, identical in bearing if not in face, and they spoke in the clipped, emotionless cadence of people whose personalities had been pared down to military necessity. They were replacing the civilian security staff, we were told, a temporary measure to ensure the archive's protection during this period of increased instability in the outer systems. I remember watching them take up positions in the main corridors, standing perfectly still in their gray armor, weapons held at a precise 45-degree angle, and I remember thinking how strange it was that people who had barely existed a year ago now stood guard over knowledge that predated their entire civilization by millennia. But I said nothing. I noted the change in my personal log and returned to my work, cataloging the latest batch of diplomatic correspondence from the border regions, documents that described in careful euphemism the destruction of colony stations and the forced relocation of civilian populations, and the implementation of enhanced compliance protocols in occupied territories. The language was always careful, always measured. My colleague Renner was the first to voice concern openly, standing in the central cafeteria with his tray of synthesized protein and reconstituted vegetables, speaking too loudly about the gaps he'd noticed in the incoming data streams, the reports that should have been arriving from council proceedings and judicial reviews that simply weren't appearing anymore. He was a constitutional scholar, had spent 30 years studying the legal frameworks that held civilizations together, and he recognized the signs of systemic breakdown when he saw them. He wanted to send a formal inquiry to the hegemonic council to request clarification on the missing documents, to exercise our charter-guaranteed right to complete access to all governmental records, regardless of classification level. The chief archivist told him to wait, to be patient, to remember that we were in a state of emergency and that certain delays were understandable, given the pressures on the administrative apparatus. Renner nodded and returned to his work, and 3 days later he was gone, transferred to a research outpost in the inner systems for consultation on historical precedents for counterinsurgency operations. We received a brief message thanking us for the opportunity and expressing his enthusiasm for the new assignment. I never heard from him again. The hum of the environmental processors changed frequency after that, or perhaps I simply started noticing it for the first time, a subtle shift in the vibration that seemed to carry a new quality, something expectant and watchful, as if the station itself had become aware of its own vulnerability. I found myself working longer hours, staying in the vaults well past the end of my assigned shift, cross-referencing casualty figures and deployment records, and trying to construct a coherent picture of what was actually happening in the outer systems. The official report spoke of steady progress, of separatist forces in retreat, of grateful populations welcoming their liberation by hegemonic peacekeepers. The medical requisition logs told a different story. Hundreds of thousands of trauma kits, burn treatments, antibiotics for bacterial infections consistent with biological warfare exposure. The shipping manifests showed military transport moving in one direction only, always outward, never bringing anyone back. And in the personal correspondence that arrived with each diplomatic pouch, encrypted messages that we were required by charter to preserve, but not to read, I could see the pattern of increasing desperation in the metadata alone. The timestamp gaps that indicated communication, blackouts, the routing paths that showed messages being bounced through a dozen relay stations to avoid military interdiction, the file sizes that suggested attachment of ages or vitostats. I noted all of this in my reports to the chief archivist, careful summaries of what I could observe without technically violating the privacy protocols. And each time I filed another report, I felt the same sick certainty that I was participating in something terrible, simply by maintaining the appearance of normal procedure. The second significant change came 8 months into the war, when the Hegemonic Council issued Emergency Decree 7, which reclassified all military records as state secrets subject to 100-year secrecy protocols, and retroactively applied the classification to documents already in the archive. We received the directive on a priority channel, accompanied by a team of military archivists, actual soldiers trained in record management, who would be assisting us in the proper curation of sensitive materials. The chief archivist called an emergency staff meeting in the main reading chamber. All 247 of us gathered in that spherical space, while she stood at the center point and explained that we would be cooperating fully with the new requirements, that our charter protections were subject to legitimate governmental oversight during times of crisis, that we had nothing to fear if we simply continued to perform our duties with the same professionalism and neutrality we had always maintained. I saw 3 archivists resign that day, walking out of the chamber and submitting their credentials at the security desk and boarding the next outbound transport. I stayed. I told myself I could do more good by remaining, by preserving what I could, by maintaining some continuity of institutional memory even under these new restrictions. I told myself I was being pragmatic. The military archivists worked in shifts, 3 teams of 5 rotating through the vaults, accompanied always by the clone soldiers who stood watch at every intersection, every access point, every terminal. They were systematic, methodical, working from prepared lists that specified exactly which records needed to be transferred to the new secure facility that was being constructed in the deepest levels of the station, chambers that required biometric authorization and carried a security clearance higher than any civilian archivist possessed. They took the casualty reports first, then the medical logs, then the communications intercepts from the occupied territories. They worked in silence, scanning each crystal into their encrypted databases, and then physically removing the originals, loading them onto graviton carts, and hauling them away into the depths, while we watched and noted the transfers in our logs and said nothing. I remember the sound their boots made on the polished stone floors, a rhythmic clicking that echoed through the corridors and seemed to mark time like a countdown to some inevitable conclusion. My work became increasingly abstract after that. Cataloging records I was no longer permitted to read, creating metadata summaries based on document titles alone, maintaining an index to information that I could no longer access to verify for accuracy or completeness. It was like being a librarian in a library where all the books had been locked away, and you were left with only the card catalog, an elaborate system of references pointing to knowledge that might no longer exist or might have been altered beyond recognition. I started having dreams about the deepest vaults, about wandering through corridors that stretched on forever, lined with empty shelves where crystals used to glow with stored memory. And in the dreams I could still smell that sharp metallic scent of burning data. Even though nothing was burning yet. Even though nothing was burning yet. Even though the environmental processors maintained their constant hum on the surface. The first execution came 3 months after the military archivists arrived. We didn't witness it directly, We simply arrived one morning to find that senior archivist Kallas was no longer at his station, and when someone finally worked up the courage to ask, we were informed that he had been caught attempting to transmit classified information to separatist forces and had been tried by military tribunal and executed within a 6-hour span. His personal quarters were sealed, his access credentials revoked retroactively, and his name was removed from all internal documents and replaced with a redacted designation. We held no memorial. We said nothing. We returned to our work. I think that was the moment when I began to understand that neutrality was impossible, that by choosing to remain silent, I was making a choice every bit as active and consequential as any open resistance, that the archive itself was being weaponized through our compliance, turned from a repository of truth into an instrument of control, through the systematic erasure of everything that contradicted the official narrative. But I stayed. I kept working. I told myself I needed more evidence, more understanding, more time to figure out the right course of action. The truth is, I was afraid. The supply transports came less frequently after the first year. And when they did arrive, they carried less food, fewer medical supplies, older and more obsolete replacement parts for the environmental systems. We were not a priority, the transport captains told us, not with military logistics stretched thin across a dozen active combat zones, and the need to maintain the battle fleets that were pushing ever deeper into separatist territory. We tightened our rationing, adjusted our maintenance schedules, began growing supplemental food in the hydroponics bays that had previously been used only for decorative plants. The clone soldiers never complained about the reduced rations. They ate their allotted portions with mechanical efficiency, and returned to their posts, and stood watch with the same perfect stillness, weapons always at that precise 45-degree angle. And I began to wonder what it felt like to be them. To be grown in a tank and educated through neural imprinting, and sent to guard a place whose purpose you might not fully comprehend, protecting knowledge you weren't permitted to access, serving masters. I wondered if they dreamed, and if they did, what they dreamed about. The turning point came 15 months into the war, when we received notice that the chief archivist was being recalled to the capital for consultation, and that her replacement would be arriving within the week. She called me to her office that final night, the small chamber she maintained overlooking the main reading floor, and she sat across from me with her hands folded on the desk, and she told me that I needed to leave, to resign, to get out while I still could, because something was coming, and she had seen enough historical patterns to recognize the shape of it, even if she didn't know the specific detail. She told me about the archive on Keshian Prime 500 years ago, how it had been purged when the military government decided that certain historical facts were inconvenient to their legitimacy, how they had executed every archivist who refused to participate in the revision, and replaced them with loyalists who would maintain only the approved version of history. She told me about the Library of Eternal Memory on Secunda 7th, burned to ash during the religious wars, and the archive of the First Concordiate, which had been infiltrated and corrupted from within, until nobody could distinguish true records from propaganda. She told me that I was young enough to start over somewhere else, that I had skills that would be valuable to anyone who needed documentation or research, that staying would accomplish nothing except making me complicit in whatever was about to happen. I told her I would think about it. She left on the morning transport, and I never learned what happened to her after that. Her replacement arrived 3 days later, a man named Corvus, who had spent the previous decade working in military intelligence and carried himself with the rigid certainty of someone who had never questioned an order in his life. His first act was to call a staff meeting and explain that we would be implementing new protocols for record verification, that all historical documents would need to be cross-referenced against the approved governmental database to ensure accuracy and consistency, and that any discrepancies would need to be resolved in favor of the official record. Someone asked what we should do if the original documents contradicted the official database. Corvus smiled and said that clearly, the original documents had been corrupted or misfiled, and it was our responsibility as archivists to correct such errors. Half the remaining staff resigned within a month. I stayed. I told myself I could do more good by remaining, by finding ways to preserve the true records, by maintaining some fragment of institutional memory. I told myself I was being strategic. The truth is, I didn't know where else to go. The systematic revision began with the oldest records, documents from conflicts so ancient that nobody living remembered them directly, casualties of wars that had ended centuries before, and whose specific details seemed distant enough to be safely malleable. The military archivists would bring us the crystals from the deep storage, and we would scan them and compare them to the official database. And when we found discrepancies, and we always found discrepancies, we would update our records to match the approved version. A battle that had killed 50,000 became a surgical strike that neutralized a military installation with minimal collateral damage. A civilian population forcibly relocated became grateful refugees, accepting humanitarian assistance. A war crime tribunal became a show trial of enemy combatants. Now, we made the changes in our system, created new crystals with the corrected information, and sent the originals back to deep storage, where presumably they were being destroyed, though we were never told explicitly. We simply stopped seeing the same documents twice, and the inventory counts in the database kept decreasing, a steady numeric decline that nobody acknowledged or discussed. The hum of the environmental processors began to develop a rhythmic quality, a pattern of surges and dips that seemed almost like breathing, and I started having trouble sleeping, lying awake in my quarters listening to that pulse and thinking about all the changes I had made that day, all the truths I had helped erase. The war entered its third year and nobody spoke about it ending anymore. The reports simply referred to ongoing stabilization operations and continued security actions without any suggestion of conclusion or resolution. The casualty figures disappeared entirely from the records we were permitted to access, replaced with vague references to acceptable operational losses that could mean anything from dozens to millions. The economic data showed military production increasing exponentially, while civilian infrastructure spending approached zero.I. The demographic projections suggested population decline across every territory under hegemonic control, but the specific causes were classified under emergency protocols. I made note of all of this in my private files, encrypting them, and hiding them in maintenance logs and equipment manifests where nobody would think to look, preserving what fragments I could of the pattern I was watching unfold. I told myself I was doing something meaningful. The clone soldiers began to change in the third year, subtle alterations that accumulated gradually until you looked at them one day and realized they weren't quite the same as they had been at the beginning. They were faster, more aggressive, their weapons held at a sharper angle, their eyes tracking movement with predatory focus. The new batches came equipped with enhanced neural processors, we were told, improved combat algorithms and threat assessment capabilities, minor upgrades to ensure optimal performance in the increasingly complex operational environment. I noticed they no longer bothered with the pretense of standing guard. They patrolled instead, moving through the corridors in pairs, weapons fully charged, and scan systems active, treating the archive like hostile territory that required constant surveillance. I noticed they had started carrying equipment for breaching sealed vaults. The final phase began without any official announcement, just a gradual increase in activity from the military archivists, longer shifts, more personnel, a sense of urgent purpose that suggested deadlines and completion targets. They stopped bothering with the oldest records and jumped forward to more recent materials, documents from the past century, then the past 50 years, then the past decade. They were working backward through time, erasing history in reverse chronological order, getting closer and closer to the present day. Someone calculated that at their current pace, they would reach the records from the beginning of the war within 3 months. Someone else pointed out that those records included evidence of what we had been doing, the documentation of our compliance with illegal orders, the systematic falsification of historical truth. Someone suggested that perhaps we were archiving our own erasure, maintaining the very records that would be used to justify eliminating the witnesses to what had been done here. Nobody said anything after that. We just kept working. I started taking longer breaks, walking through the upper levels where civilian visitors used to come to access the public records before the war, before the clone soldiers, back when the archive had been open to any citizen with a valid research query. The reading rooms were empty now, displays powered down, the floating terminals drifting in their predetermined patterns with no one to activate them. Dust had begun to accumulate on the surfaces despite the environmental controls, a fine gray powder that shouldn't have been possible in a sealed station, but which appeared anyway, settling on everything like the residue of some invisible decay. I found myself standing in the central chamber more frequently, looking up at the distant ceiling and remembering what it had felt like when I first arrived, that sense of being part of something larger than myself, something that transcended the petty struggles of governments and armies, something that would endure long after all of us were gone because truth was stronger than power, and knowledge was a light that couldn't be extinguished. I had believed that once. Had believed it so completely that I had built my entire life around the assumption that it was possible to remain neutral, to stay above the conflict, to preserve the record without taking sides. I understood now that there was no such thing as neutrality, that every choice to remain silent was a choice to enable, that the archive itself had become a weapon through our compliance, and that I'd helped forge that weapon with every correction I made, every discrepancy I resolved, every truth I agreed to erase because I was afraid of the consequences of resistance. The smell of burning data crystals began to appear in the corridors during the 4th year, that sharp metallic scent mixing with the recycled air and the ozone from the ventilation systems, growing stronger each day until it became impossible to ignore. The military archivists had stopped pretending they were transferring records to secure storage. They were bringing them up from the deepest vaults and feeding them into industrial plasma furnaces installed in the main cargo bays, destroying the originals after scanning them into whatever database they were maintaining. eliminating the physical evidence that any other version of history had ever existed. We could hear the furnaces running, a deep roar that vibrated through the station's structure and seemed to make the environmental processors struggle to compensate, the hum rising and falling in distress as the air quality deteriorated from the ash and vapor that the filtration systems couldn't fully scrub. I watched them burn 3 centuries of treaty negotiations, the complete record of diplomatic efforts that had prevented at least a dozen major wars, irreplaceable documentation of how civilizations had chosen peace over destruction. I watched them burn the testimony from war crimes tribunals, depositions from survivors, describing atrocities in detail, precise enough to ensure such things could never be denied or minimized, or explained away as necessary evils. I watched them burn casualty lists, medical records, personal correspondence, anything that contradicted the narrative of a clean war, a just war, a war that had been fought with honor and restraint. They burned it all, and we stood in the corridors and watched the smoke rise and did nothing. There were 43 archivists left by then, down from 247 when I arrived, the rest having resigned or disappeared, or been transferred to positions that nobody ever quite explained. The ones who remained were the ones like me, who had convinced themselves they were staying for the right reasons, who believed they could preserve something by remaining complicit, who were too afraid or too paralyzed, or too invested in their own self-image, as scholars above politics, to acknowledge what we had become. I see their faces sometimes, in the quiet moments when I try to sleep, all of us standing in that corridor, watching the smoke rise and saying nothing, doing nothing, maintaining our professional detachment while the truth burned. The end came quickly when it finally arrived, moving through the station like a pressure wave, inevitable and consuming. The military archivists finished their work in the deep vaults and began working their way upward, clearing level by level, destroying the physical records and replacing them with authorized digital copies stored on encrypted servers controlled by the military administration. They reached sub-level 7 on a morning that felt exactly like every other morning, the environmental processors humming their steady rhythm, the clone soldiers maintaining their patrols, everything appearing normal until the military archivists arrived at my station and informed me that I was being temporarily relieved of duty while they processed my section. I asked how long it would take. They told me it would be permanent. They told me that my services were no longer required, that the archive was being restructured under pure military administration, that all civilian archivists would be reassigned to other positions or released from employment as appropriate. They gave me 6 hours to clear my personal quarters and report to the main transport bay for evacuation. I spent 4 of those hours in the deep vaults, walking through corridors I wasn't technically authorized to access anymore, past clone soldiers who either didn't care or didn't notice, down into the oldest sections where the rock walls were rough and unpolished, and the environmental controls were less precise. I went to the chamber where I had spent most of my first year, cataloging treaty documents from the formation of the original Galactic Councils, and I found it empty, every crystal gone, the storage matrices blank and cold. I went to the medical records vault and found it sealed, plasma welded shut, the metal still warm from the cutting torches they had used to ensure nobody could ever access what had been inside. I went to the central archive, the heart of the entire facility, where the master catalog was supposed to maintain a complete index of every document we had ever received. And I found Corvus standing at the main terminal, methodically purging entries, watching the database counts decrease as he deleted centuries of accumulated knowledge with methodical keystrokes. He saw me standing there and he smiled, that same calm smile from his first day, and he said that I should be proud of the work I had done here, that I had helped preserve the integrity of our civilization's historical record by ensuring that future generations would understand their past correctly, without the distortions and misinterpretations that accumulated when documentation was allowed to propagate unchecked. He said, I had served with honor. I left without responding, walked back through the corridors to my quarters, packed my few personal belongings, and reported to the transport bay as instructed. There were 7 other archivists waiting there, the last of us, standing silently with our bags, while the clone soldiers checked our credentials and scanned us for unauthorized data storage devices. They found my encrypted files, of course. They were thorough and professional and very good at their jobs. They confiscated my personal terminal, logged it as evidence of security violation, and informed me that I would be required to report to military intelligence for debriefing upon arrival at the capital. I never made it to the capital. The transport developed a critical malfunction 3 days into the journey, a failure in the navigation systems that sent us off course, and required an emergency diversion to a repair station in the outer territories. While we waited for replacement parts, I walked away from the docking bay and disappeared into the crowds and never looked back. That was 6 years ago. I'm writing this from a settlement on the edge of mapped space, a mining colony where nobody asks questions and documentation is whatever you claim it to be. I work in the local administrative office, managing supply inventories and maintenance schedules, keeping track of tonnage and shifts, and the small mundane details that keep a frontier outpost functional. It's not prestigious work, not intellectual, nothing like what I used to do. I prefer it this way. The war ended officially 3 years ago. Wah. The hegemonic council declared total victory, complete pacification of all separatist forces, a new era of unified governance and shared prosperity. The official histories describe a brief, targeted campaign that eliminated threats to civilized order while minimizing disruption to civilian populations. The casualty figures are classified for security reasons. The specific details of military operations are classified for security reasons. 1. The records of what was done and how and to whom, all classified, all sealed, all unavailable for review for the next 100 years, by which time everyone who lived through it will be dead, and the truth will be whatever the official database says it is. I know what I helped make possible. I know that by staying, by complying, by making all those careful corrections and maintaining my professional neutrality, and telling myself I was preserving something, I became part of the machinery that erased the truth. I know that the archive I served doesn't exist anymore, not as anything except a name attached to a military installation that maintains approved records for approved purposes. I know that knowledge died not because it was burned or lost or forgotten, but because people like me chose not to defend it when defense was still possible. Sometimes I dream about the hum of the environmental processors, that deep subsonic pulse that became the heartbeat of my life for so many years. In the dreams, I'm walking through corridors lined with empty vaults, and the hum is getting louder, more insistent, building to some catastrophic crescendo that I know will tear the station apart when it finally peaks. I walk faster, trying to reach the central chamber, trying to warn someone, but the corridors keep stretching longer, and the hum keeps building, and I wake up before I ever reach the center, gasping in the darkness of my small quarters here on the edge of nothing. The smell of burning data crystals follows me sometimes, phantom traces that appear without warning, that sharp metallic scent mixing with whatever I'm actually smelling, not cooking food or industrial lubricant, or the recycled air of another station. And for a moment I'm back there, standing in that corridor, watching the smoke rise while the truth burns. I tell myself I learned something from what happened, that I understand now what I should have done differently, that I would make different choices if I were faced with the same situation again. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if anyone really knows how they'll act until the moment arrives and the choice becomes real and the consequences become unavoidable. I don't know if courage is something you possess or something you discover only in the instant when it's required. I don't know if my continued survival, my choice to walk away and disappear instead of staying to face whatever punishment awaited me, was wisdom or cowardice or just another form of complicity. What I do know is that somewhere in databases I will never access, maintained by people I will never meet, there exists a version of history that describes the war as a necessary triumph of order over chaos. And that version is the only version that will be taught to future generations. The only version that will be studied by scholars. The only version that will be studied by scholars. The only version that will be And I helped write it. I helped refine it, correct it, purge it of inconvenient truths, make it clean and simple and acceptable. I stood at my terminal and made the changes they requested and told myself I was just doing my job, just maintaining professional standards, just following the protocols that ensured consistent documentation across all systems. I was a scholar. You and all, now some test idea. I was neutral. You. I kept the truth safe. Until I didn't. There's a young woman who works in the administrative office here, fresh off a transport from the inner systems, full of enthusiasm about starting a new life on the frontier. She saw my credentials once, noticed that I had training as an archivist, asked me excitedly about what it was like to work in the Grand Archive, told me she had always dreamed of becoming a scholar, of helping preserve humanity's collective knowledge for future generations. I told her it was exactly like she imagined. Important work. Meaningful work, right? A chance to be part of something larger than yourself. I didn't tell her about the hum of the environmental processors, or the smell of burning crystals, or the choice that she would inevitably face between truth and survival, when the two became mutually exclusive. I didn't tell her that the dream she carries is already dead, killed by people like me who chose comfort over courage when it mattered most. I just smiled and told her to follow her passion, that the galaxy needs dedicated scholars now more than ever. Maybe that was the right thing to say. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know anymore. What I know is that on quiet nights, when the mining equipment powers down, and the colony settles into its brief period of darkness, I can still hear that hum, that deep subsonic pulse that vibrates through everything. And I know that somewhere, in installations I will never see, the work continues. The records are being maintained. The history is being preserved. The truth is being kept safe in crystalline memory banks buried deep beneath protective layers of stone and steel and official authorization. And none of it is true. None of it is real. It's just a carefully constructed fiction, authorized and approved and protected by law, maintained by professionals who tell themselves they're scholars and not propagandists, who believe they're preserving truth and not manufacturing consent. I know this because I was one of them. I know this because I helped build the lie that will outlast us all. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake in the darkness listening to ghosts of machinery that doesn't exist here, is that I don't know what else I could have done. I don't know what resistance would have looked like, what form it could have taken that wouldn't have been immediately crushed by the same overwhelming power that crushed everything else. I don't know if my resignation would have changed anything, if my death would have meant anything, if any individual action could have altered the trajectory of a system that was designed to be inevitable. But I know that I'll never be certain, because I never tried. I chose survival. I chose compliance. I chose to tell myself that staying was strategic, that documenting the erasure was somehow valuable, that maintaining my position gave me options I didn't exercise and opportunities I didn't seize. I chose to watch the truth burn, while pretending neutrality was possible. And now I live with that choice, here on the edge of map space, managing inventories and maintaining schedules, and helping this young, eager woman believe that scholarship still means something, that knowledge still has power, that truth still matters. Maybe it does. Maybe somewhere, someone is finding ways to preserve what we failed to protect. Maybe the fragments I hid in maintenance logs will be discovered someday by someone brave enough to do what I wouldn't. Maybe the pattern I documented will help someone else recognize the signs before it's too late. Or maybe knowledge just dies, burning quietly in industrial furnaces, while people like me stand in corridors and watch and tell themselves they're serving something larger than themselves. The hum continues. The processors maintain their rhythm. The environmental controls keep everything stable and controlled and perfectly preserved. And in the deepest vaults where the truth used to be, there is only emptiness and the fading scent of burning, and the silence of things that will never be remembered. I was an archivist once. I kept the truth safe. Until I didn't.